Hello, beautiful souls, and welcome back to Beyond the Mind with Ani. I'm your host, Ani, and I'm so deeply grateful you are here. Here we have a space that is raw, and it's not about pretending. It is not about being perfect. Here we don't bypass the mess. We meet it. We speak the truth that spiritual circles often silence. We hold the space for the parts of us that are still healing, still angry, and still unsure. Because real growth doesn't happen in curated light, it happens in the shadows we are brave enough to face. So today, I want us to ask something that might feel uncomfortable but deeply necessary. What if your spiritual journey, the thing that was meant to liberate you, is actually keeping you numb? What if the affirmations, the mantras, the talk of letting go and staying high vibe are just another layer, another mask covering up the raw human truth that desperately wants to be felt? I know that this might sound confronting, but this isn't an episode about judgment. It's not about calling anyone out. It's an invitation to look at things from different perspective, to get honest and to get real, because healing doesn't always look peaceful. Awakening isn't always graceful. And sometimes the most spiritual thing you can do is to cry, to rage, or finally tell the truth you've been holding in your chest for years. So, if you're ready, let's begin and let's dive deep and go beyond the filters. We live in a time where emotional pain isn't just inconvenient, it is treated like a flaw in your character, as if hurting means you have failed at being evolved, as if feeling too deeply is an obstacle to your success, not part of your wholeness. You've probably heard this too. Be positive. Just move on, especially after breakups. Be grateful. Others have it worse. I am sure they sound very familiar. And I've sat down with those words more times than I can count. They have often said this with the best of intentions, meant to uplift you, to help you move forward. But for me, they always landed like quiet rejection, a polished form of dismissal, one that quietly made me question myself. It made me wonder if something was wrong with me. Why did moving on seem so effortless for others while I was stuck here with this ache? And every time I heard them, something inside of me would tense up, not because I didn't want to heal, but because I was being asked to skip the part where I was still bleeding. It felt like my ability to suffer quietly was being confused with emotional strength, as if true strength was to pretend it didn't hurt, as if peace was a mask I was expected to wear even when my insides were cracking. But after a lot of sitting through this numbness, the resentment, and the ache of not being seen, I started to see something clearly. Pretending isn't healing, it is coping, it is survival. It keeps the peace on the outside while a war rages quietly within. True healing doesn't happen through bypassing, it happens through presence. It requires you to stop performing and start feeling. It calls you to return to the parts of yourself you have abandoned for the sake of appearing okay. From social media trends, we are constantly sold that the illusion that happiness is the ultimate goal, and anything that disrupts it must be fixed or silenced. Pain is pathologized, grief is inconvenient, anger is labeled low vibration, and vulnerability, it's something you're told that to grow out of it, to raise above it, like it's a phase we should be ashamed of. But here's the question I want to ask you today, one that cuts through the noise. What if this addiction to positivity is not a sign of spiritual advancement, but a symptom of collective emotional disconnection? What if in our desperate attempt to stay high vibe, we've become emotionally malnourished? Psychologist Whitney Goodman calls this culture toxic positivity. It's the denial of authentic human experience in favor of curated light. It's the pressure to smile when you're breaking It's the glorification of suppression in the name of peace. But peace without truth isn't peace, it's paralysis. And sometimes the most sacred thing you can do for your soul is to admit without shame, I am not okay right now. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with it, because that's not weakness. That's the beginning of healing, true healing. What is spiritual bypassing? The term spiritual bypassing was first coined by psychologist John Welwood, who described it as a tendency to use spiritual beliefs or practices to sidestep, rather than confront, unresolved emotional issues, wounds, or psychological needs. It often sounds like this: everything happens for a reason. It's all just a mirror. I've outgrown that version of myself. Or the most subtle one, I choose peace. And while these phrases might appear wise, even evolved, they also serve as kind of armor, a soft, poetic denial. We use them to protect ourselves from the uncomfortable, messy, and often unfiltered nature of being fully human. Instead of sitting with the pain, with the grief, we label it attachment. Instead of acknowledging our anger, we try to vibrate higher. Instead of allowing sadness, we slap a gratitude affirmation on top of it and call it growth. Wellwood himself later admitted that he had fallen into that trap, using mindfulness to avoid intimacy and ideas like non attachment to justify emotional distance. He realized he had spiritualized his own defenses, and the truth is, many of us do this, not because we're weak or insincere, but because facing our inner world requires immense courage. Spiritual bypassing doesn't always come from arrogance. Sometimes it comes from fear, sometimes exhaustion, sometimes from the aching belief that feeling our pain would destroy us. So we climb into that light to escape the dark, forgetting that real light includes all the shades, not just the palatable ones. But what if the real path of awakening doesn't transcend the human experience, but deepens it? What if healing isn't about escaping your shadow, but learning how to hold it? Avoiding emotional pain doesn't make it disappear. It relocates. It gets buried in the body, encoded in the nervous system like a memory that was never allowed to be spoken. As psychiatrist Dr. Bessel van der Kolk explains it in the book The Body Keeps the Score, unprocessed trauma doesn't just haunt the mind, it lives in the body. It becomes chronic tension in the jaw you clench every night, the anxiety that has no name, the numbness you cannot shake, the gut issues, migraines, fatigue, all whispering what your voice never had permission to say. And Western cultures has long glorified stoicism. We admire the strong ones, the ones that don't flinch, who keep going, who say, I'm fine with a smile. But what we call strength is often just practice suppression. What we call maturity is sometimes just learned dissociation. And this stoicism doesn't just affect us individually, it becomes cultural. Entire societies are built on the emotional freezing. We stop crying, we stop feeling, we stop caring. We begin to confuse numbness with wisdom. We praise detachment as enlightenment. We admire spiritual leaders, influencers, and healers who seem untouched by emotions, as if transcendence requires a disconnection from human heart. But here's the deeper tragedy. When we cannot feel our own pain, we lose the ability to recognize it in others. We scroll past war victims. We ignore the cries of animals in slaughterhouses. We grow desensitized to injustice, to inequality, to cruelty, because we have normalized emotional shutdown as a survival mechanism. We begin to call ourselves spiritual while stepping over the suffering that spirituality is meant to respond to. Detachment becomes a prison. Empathy becomes a threat. And spiritual growth, it becomes performance, a curated image, a filtered version of healing where everything is love and light as long as the darkness stays quiet. But true spirituality doesn't work that way. It's not about mastering neutrality. It's about becoming so deeply human that your heart stays open, even when it hurts, even when it's inconvenient, even when no one else is watching. Maybe the question isn't how do we stop feeling so much? Maybe it's how do we feel more and still stay present? How do we reconnect to what we've buried so that we don't pass the disconnection down to those who come after us? Because the cost of disconnection isn't just personal, it is generational. And the healing, it starts when we choose not to numb anymore. The love and light trap. Let's talk about something that almost every spiritual seeker faces, the obsession with being high vibe. There's a subtle and sometimes very loud pressure in spiritual communities to always be peaceful, calm, radiant, and soft spoken, to always glow with love and light no matter what's going on inside. But what happens when life hits hard, when anxiety spirals, when rage bubbles up, when tears won't stop falling, crying suddenly feels so messy, rage is too aggressive, anxiety the advice is often just meditate it away, as if complex human emotions have such simple fixes. This creates a heavy, silent shame around being real. We start asking ourselves, why am I still triggered? Why am I not healed yet? Why can't I just stay in love and light like everyone else? But here's the truth we rarely say out loud. That's the illusion. Real healing isn't neat or linear. It's rarely tidy or pretty. Instead, healing is messy. Sometimes it's ugly. Sometimes it looks like some like screaming into a pillow, sobbing on the bathroom floor when no one's watching. And that, my friends, is not repression. It's not failure. It's a sacred release. And Carl Jung said it beautifully. One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. So, what if true growth isn't about hiding in the darkness? What if it's about inviting it in, sitting with it, and learning from it? What if the shame around low vibration feeling is actually a barrier to the depth and richness of our healing? Maybe it's time to stop chasing a permanent state of high vibe and start embracing the full spectrum of what it means to be human, to feel everything, the light and the shadows, and find peace in tension between them, because only then can we experience true wholeness, not just surface level peace. Here's the part we don't talk about enough. Spiritual bypassing isn't just a personal defense mechanism, it has collective consequences. When we say things like everything is perfect or it's all just part of the plan, while suffering unfolds all around us, we're not rising above, we're turning away. Because while people are struggling, ecosystems are collapsing, and animals are being exploited, and system quietly drives us inequality, wrapping ourselves in a blanket of bliss doesn't make us wise. It just makes us silent. There's a reason that certain narratives thrive in spiritual spaces. If people are too focused on staying high vibe, they would probably avoid to ask hard questions, challenging norm, and or speak uncomfortable truth, and the larger system stays intact. Spiritual detachment, when used selectively, becomes a tool of distraction. And as Noam Chomsky once pointed out, the smart way to keep people passive and obedient is to strictly limit the spectrum of acceptable opinion, but allow very lively debate within the spectrum. And I think this applies to spirituality too. The system doesn't mind the crystals and your chanting and your sages or your silence, as long as you don't wake up to it, as long as your awakening stays quiet, private, and inward. But what if true awakening asks more of us? What if it includes both stillness and action, both compassion and confrontation, both inner peace and moral courage. Maybe rising your vibration doesn't mean floating above the world, but feeling it more deeply. Maybe enlightenment isn't about escaping discomfort, because real spirituality doesn't turn away from suffering. It meets it. It listens. It responds, not from place of fear, but from love that's awake enough to care and brave enough to act. We don't need to become more spiritual, in my opinion. We need to become more honest. Healing isn't about reaching a state of constant bliss that just doesn't exist. It's not about fixing yourself or staying positive all the time. It's about feeling everything you once had to suppress to survive. So, how do we begin? Here are a few things that helped me and might help you too. I stopped escaping my pain. I gave it a voice. I started writing, not beautifully, but truthfully, letters that I've never sent, frustrated scribbles, streams of raw emotions. Writing became a mirror, a container, a quiet rebellion against bypassing. It didn't fix me, but it freed me. I moved my body a lot. I moved my body to move the pain. Gym sessions became a sanctuary, not to punish my body, but to reconnect with it. And one day, when I felt powerless or angry, lifting weights grounded me. The discipline, the sweat, the structure, it gave the chaos in my mind somewhere to go. Healing isn't just emotional, it's also physical. And our nervous system often needs movement more than motivation. It is so interesting that the body often knows the truth long before the mind can explain it. Healing starts when we learn to stay with our sensation, not just our stories. I also read. I read and I read a lot, not to escape, but to remember. Books reminded me that I wasn't alone. Other people had been through the dark and came out with wisdom. Reading gave me a language for what I couldn't yet name and opened doors in my mind I didn't know were closed. And I started to ask myself, what truth am I afraid to face, and what would happen if I didn't judge that particular emotion? Real healing doesn't ask you to become someone else. It asks you to come home to who you were before you were taught to live yourself. And I also want to give you a loving disclaimer. Everything I've shared here comes from my personal journey. What helped me feel, stay, rebuild myself slowly. But I'm not a psychologist. These aren't as clinical tools. These are emotional invitations. If you are carrying something heavy or feel stuck, please reach out to a trained professional. You deserve safety, support, and guidance tailored to you. But please, healing isn't linear. I want you to remember that. It isn't always pretty, but it is real and it is possible, especially when we stop running from ourselves and start listening. I want you to remember that it is not your job to transcend your humanity. It is your sacred task to inhabit it fully, honestly, and courageously. So today I invite you to pause and gently ask yourself, where might I be using light to avoid the dark? And what emotions have I been quietly carrying that doesn't need to be fixed, just finally felt? And beautiful souls, I want you to remember that we don't heal by rising above our humanness. We heal by coming home to it tenderly, truthfully, breath by breath. And I truly want to thank you for being here, for lending me your ears. And if this episode stirs something in you, if it whispered a truth you've been waiting to hear, please pass it on to someone who might need it too. And if you're ready to walk deeper into this work, subscribe and leave a review, and come and say hello on Beyond the Mind with Ani on other platforms as well. So until next time, stay soft, stay brave, and always go beyond the mind.